As Raphael just said, my name is Nico Müller, and I'm a philosopher based at the University of Basel. And for the past 2 years, ever since I published my book, I haven't been working about Kantianism anymore. I switched gears, in part due to funding reasons, and I've been working on this project about phasing out animal experimentation. And I work on this topic because I'm paid to. And I'm paid to by a larger research program that's called the NRP 79. And that was initiated by the Swiss Federal Council. So that's the executive in Switzerland, right? That's the government, with the express aim of finding ways for Switzerland to reduce its reliance on animal experimentation. So there is political interest in working in that direction, right? And that's funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. I'm just one person within this research program. Many other people are working on new replacement methods, new 3R stuff, replace, reduce, refine. But there are also some social scientists and humanities scholars, just like I am, working on new ways of looking at the issue. So I got here via train. I took a train from where I live, south of Basel in Switzerland, to Lausanne, to Paris, then to London, then to Cambridge. Got here on time, everything worked perfectly. I had it all planned out, and everything worked exactly as I intended until a politician got involved. And now I have much more space, much more time at my disposal for talking to you. My strategic adjustment is to just ramble a bit. So I hope you're patient enough for that. But I think that's part of planning, right? Planning doesn't mean you have a set course of action that you have to stick to. But the world always puts obstacles in your way, and you have to adjust strategically. I think that's just part of what strategizing means, and that's going to be relevant for my talk as well. Okay, so today I'd like to talk about one campaign that I find very interesting. It's this Herbie's Law campaign that Steve Race just talked about in his brief video. That's by Animal Free Research UK, and other campaigns like it. I'm very interested in these proposals to phase out animal experimentation gradually through strategic means. And I'll comment on that as it stands kind of between the 3Rs and an animal experimentation ban. That title will make more sense at the end of the presentation. So Steve Race only briefly mentioned what Herbie's Law was, or even just mentioned the name. Just to recap that for those who don't specialize in animal experimentation, it's a campaign by Animal Free Research UK, which is a well-known animal welfare organization here in the UK. And it's not one specific law they're selling, right? It's a new kind of law they're campaigning for. They do have a draft bill, but more generally, they're interested in expanding animal experimentation policy beyond what it usually does, right? Traditionally, animal experimentation policy means setting out a licensing procedure. Usually that involves harm-benefit analysis, what's allowed and what isn't, kind of that kind of thing. And with the Herbie's Law campaign, they were asking for a new kind of animal experimentation law, and in their policy brief, they say what they want this law to do. They wanted, first of all, to specify a target year for the full replacement of animal experimentation in medical research. So this isn't about toxicological testing, this isn't about education, this is about medical research. And the target year shall be 2035, they say. So 10 years from now, that's extremely ambitious, but it's good to be ambitious. They also want this law to describe activities that government must undertake in order to achieve this goal by 2035, and that shall be packaged into action plans and regular reports. The law shall also provide for the setup of an expert advisory committee to oversee these activities and provide scientific advice. And in the meantime, in the shorter term, the law shall also create a legal basis for more practical support and training for scientists, so they're aware of the alternatives that exist to animal experimentation in medical research. Now, with these kinds of demands, the Herbie's Law campaign isn't an outlier. It's not a crazy idea. This has been proposed time and again by different campaigns and political proposals in the last 10 or 15 years. Here are just a couple of examples. The European Parliament already voted, and by an extremely large majority approved, a non-legislative resolution, so essentially a statement of intent, for a full phase-out strategy for all animal experimentation in the European Union. So this is even more comprehensive than Herbie's Law, right? Because it doesn't just cover medical research, but all kinds of animal experimentation. Only a handful of European Parliament members did not say yes to this, but then again, this isn't a legislative act, right? The stakes were really low here. that the European Commission was not forced to act on this basis. It was just kind of proposed that it could act, and it declined. The European Commission is much more conservative and cautious. What they did say yes to was developing a roadmap towards phasing out animal testing in regulatory toxicology. So the kinds of tests that the regulator asks for in the European Union when, for instance, a chemicals company wants to bring a new product on the market, in that area, they want to gradually decrease reliance on animal experimentation. So this is largely about chemicals legislation. They say it's towards phasing out animal testing. That's the ambition. What they've strongly communicated so far is just that they want to reduce reliance on animal experimentation without naming any specific reduction milestones. So we'll see what comes out of this process. This is still ongoing. There would have been other examples from the Netherlands particularly, also from Germany, where lots of debates have been going on certain processes. The Germans have been working on a reduction roadmap for all animal experimentation in their country. They were almost done. We're about to publish that strategy, and then the SPD lost the elections. The coalition rather disbanded, and the new conservative-leaning government does not want to publish that strategy. So that's one of the problems you can face when you try to come up with these things. And even in the country where things usually happen last, which is Switzerland, we've seen these debates happening. So the Swiss Parliament has also debated a comprehensive phase-out plan for animal experiments of what we call severity degrees 1 to 3. That excludes severity degree 0, which according to the law means no constraint. So a full phase-out plan for all of the animal experiments in Switzerland that actually harm animals in a way the law recognizes. That was the idea. I was actually invited to give a little input to a commission of the Parliament on this issue, and I've been more frustrated than before. After this, I cannot tell you about all of that, but I can talk about what I said anyway. Okay, so these kinds of campaigns, to my mind, this is now the cutting edge of animal experimentation politics. Animal experimentation politics used to be mostly about introducing prohibitions here and now. And now I think this is really where the action is. It's calling for strategies, gradual plans, that kind of thing. But these proposals always raise three important questions. The first is, what does this add to 3R's efforts? Right? All of these institutions, all of these jurisdictions, rather, already have efforts to promote replacements, reductions, and refinements in animal experimentation. And I've been confronted with this problem a lot, that Swiss MPs actually ask me, what do you mean, should we have a phase-out plan? We do have one, don't we? We have all this 3R's business that we're dumping taxpayer money into. So what exactly are people asking for on top of that? Right? That's an important question. So what don't we already have this? What does it add? Second, is this calling for an animal experimentation ban? In Switzerland, this is an extremely game-changing question, because since the 1980s, we've voted 5 times on whether we want to ban animal experimentation, and every single time it's been a spectacular defeat for the animal advocates. So banning animal experimentation immediately is an extremely unpopular proposition in Switzerland. It's a way for politicians to lose public credibility even. So this is a game-changing question, right? People often think a phase-out plan would essentially be a ban in increments. So what's the relation here? Difficult question. And third, how politically promising is the demand? From the animal advocate side of the discussion, I sense that there's a lot of enthusiasm for this idea. Let's ask for a strategy rather than a full ban right now, because that's more nuanced and that will get us more political buying power. And the question is, to what extent is that true? I'll have some thoughts on that. So I'll go through these 3 questions in my talk now. To begin with, what do these demands for phase-out plans add to the 3R's activities we already have? First of all, I think it's just important. I didn't know that Cambridge University had a patent on definitions, but okay, then that fits. It's important to define what we mean by a strategy in this context. I think we all kind of know what we mean by a strategy. Sometimes it's important to articulate it out loud. And for a paper published early in 2024, I looked at 10 different political projects, let's call them. So either bills that call for phase-out planning, or campaigns by NGOs, or actual first steps towards phase-out planning by government agencies or government-paid think tanks, for instance, from the Netherlands or some US government agencies. And I looked at what do they think phase-out planning is. And of course, if you ask PETA on the one hand and the US EPA on the other hand, what one could do to phase out animal experimentation, you'll get very different answers. But I think the core notion of what it would even mean to have a strategy at all, I think is in common. And it's a fairly simple notion. I call it the 3 M's: measures, milestones, and metrics. That's the 3 things you really need at the core in order to have a strategy in the relevant sense. Measures are the activities that government or some other relevant institutions like a government agency has to carry out. So who does what? That needs to be clear. Milestones are the outcome-oriented goals that are meant to be achieved by these activities. So that could be the intermediate goals along the way to an ultimate goal. The last milestone might be a full phase-out, might be a gradual reduction, like in Germany. But it's important that these are defined in terms of outcomes, right? And metrics are the numbers we use to track progress along the way. If you don't have these 3 things, you don't have a strategy in the relevant sense. And I think that already helps. When politicians ask me, well, don't we already have a strategy because we have these 3 R's activities? I can tell them the easy answer is, we have elements, potential elements for a strategy. Right? The 3 R's are compatible with the 3 M's because they essentially name a genre of measure one could take. Right? These are activities. You could, for instance, provide funding support for innovation projects, for new replacements, reductions, and refinements. You could launch educational modules for informing scientists about new possibilities. You could hand out awards to people who innovate breakthroughs in these spaces. So those are the kinds of activities 3R centers already engage in, right? These are activities. Maybe just one little caveat here, just to get a possible misunderstanding out of the way. Reduce, in this context, does not mean reducing the number of procedures per country or animals used per country or per jurisdiction. It means reducing the sample size of the study, right? Doing good statistics, essentially, in order not to use more animals than you need to in order to get to a certain level of statistical predictive power. Right? So this is really about designing the individual study. It's not about the overall reduction. So what the 3 R's don't do is give you milestones or metrics. That's what you lack in a purely 3 R's oriented framework. There's no big master plan for how we shall overcome science in 20 or 50 or 150 years' time thanks to the 3 R's. It's just not that kind of a vision-oriented framework. It's a forward-looking framework. It looks at where we are right now, what are opportunities for small improvements, and we kind of can keep going in this way in an open-ended way. That's how the 3 R's operate. It's not a vision or strategy-oriented, milestones-oriented approach in that way. It's also not a particularly metrics-oriented approach. And the people to ask about this are the people working for 3R centers themselves. They're often very open about it being about the fact that it's very difficult to find good metrics to track progress in the 3Rs. The NC3Rs, for instance, in 2012, the NC3Rs is the British 3R Centre. In 2012, they published a report about their impact assessment framework, and it's extremely complicated. They did their best, and they relied on impact evaluation instruments that are known from other policy areas. That's all fine, but it's extremely complicated. And it has a special annex titled, "The Home Office numbers are not a gauge in 3R's progress," in big letters. And they explained, don't use the overall statistics of how many animals were used, harmed, how many procedures carried out in the UK to evaluate our work, because that depends on factors that are way beyond what we can do. And that's just interesting to see, and it illustrates how it's a tricky business with the 3Rs and clear metrics for evaluation, right? So that's the quick answer to the question, don't we already have a phase-out strategy? Well, not in that sense, right? Because we don't have any clear milestones of what we want to achieve with our 3Rs efforts, and we don't have clear metrics to see whether it's working or not, right? That's a quick answer. Now here's a slightly longer answer that builds on that. I also think, in addition to what I've already said, the 3Rs don't give you all of the measures you need in order to phase out animal experimentation realistically. You need something more than the 3Rs. What do you need in addition? In order to explain, I have to talk briefly about innovation in animal research. This really concerns science now, just like Herbie's law. This is not about regulatory testing, education, and so on. Already in 1961, the British scientist and regulator William Lane Petter described animal research as a pipeline that continually moves forward. At any given point in time, you can take a snapshot of science, and you'll see a certain number of animals being harmed, you'll see a certain number of harmful procedures being carried out on them in a given jurisdiction like the UK. And maybe if you line up your snapshots year on year, the numbers look fairly similar. In Switzerland, we have basically stagnant numbers for over 20 years, right? So well, not over 20 years, since 1996 to be precise. So the numbers per year are very, very similar, but that doesn't mean that the same kinds of animals are being used or that the same kinds of procedures are being carried out. There's a constant change of lineup in the background. On the one hand, animals are constantly leaving science thanks to the 3 Rs, and particularly replacement. Right? These animals have been replaced by new cell cultures, organoids, organ on chip, computational models, human participant studies in a new innovative way, and so on. The things Steve Race was also talking about. So animals are made obsolete. In theory, they should no longer be used. There's legislation to that effect already in force in many countries. So that's a way for animals to leave science. But on the other hand, animals are also constantly entering the pipeline of science because people ask new questions and address some of those new questions by relying on animals as experimental models. And in fact, we are constantly coming up with new ways of using animals as models in science. So animal experimentation itself is a very innovative area of science, or sort of cross-cutting area of science. It's not just a thing that is being done out of traditions and because people can't think of anything better. People are constantly coming up with new innovative ways of harming animals for science. And just to give one example, think of genetic modification, right? Genetic modification very often is used in animal experimentation in order to give animals new features that they wouldn't otherwise have, so that they maybe resemble a target system in a way so that they can serve as its model, right? Or you can take certain features away, maybe also. And that's an interesting way for animals to get into the pipeline newly, right? And if you look at the Swiss numbers, this illustrates it rather well, I believe. Here are the numbers from around the turn of the millennium. Displayed in blue, you can see in millions of animals how many animals were actually used in studies. So this excludes the surplus animals, as they're sometimes called. These are just the number of animals actually used in this tiny country for scientific purposes. You can see the numbers in blue are sort of waxing and waning around the 600,000 to 750,000 area. And you could extend that timeline until today, and you'll see the same line waxing and waning in this general area. But meanwhile, in red, you can see a creeping, almost linear increase in the genetically modified animal models. And what this tells you is these are new animals in a very important sense. These are not the same animals that were used beforehand, right? So if the overall numbers are the same, but the genetically modified animals are newly coming in, that means some animals must, by some way, have left science also, right? This is the turnover in action. And the reason genetic modification is just a good example to illustrate this is that for legal reasons, these have to be reported specially for the official statistic, right? You don't have to report other new models in the same way. The genetically modified models just show up in the statistic a little bit like a tracer. So that's just a good example, but there's more ways of innovating new animal experiments. That's not the only one, right? You could also go the low-tech route and, for instance, use an animal that is lesser used, not very popular in science yet, right? Everybody works with zebrafish and mice and rats. Not as many people work with Antarctic ice fish or dune mice or other sort of extremophiles. There are philosophers of science who actively call on us to use more lesser used species because they worry that by relying too much on just a limited range of standard model organisms, we are missing scientific opportunities. Particularly these extremophiles, right, like Antarctic ice fish or dune mice, can be interesting because they have certain very pronounced features. So that can make them interesting models to study certain systems. Right? So people are actively campaigning for this, in fact, and that's just important to keep in mind. So the 3 Rs are at best part of the solution, right? It's like we're trying to drain a bathtub. We have to pull the plug, yes, but we also have to turn the tap off. Otherwise, it's really not a very effective way of going about it at all. So we have to be interested, if we want to bring down the numbers within the pipeline of animals harmed and of harmful procedures carried out, in how many new animals enter the pipeline as well. Therefore, a phase-out plan, a phase-out strategy realistically can't just be a 3 Rs strategy. from my perspective. And also not a replacement strategy. People are often very enthusiastic about replacement in particular. I think it's part of the solution. It reacts to what's already ongoing, but it doesn't stop innovation in new animal models. Here, innovation is really also part of the problem. So we have to be interested in what happens at the innovation side. And that's really tricky business, right? It's very difficult to tell where innovation is going to go next, right? We have to reflect on what factors determine which models scientists are most interested in using, what models they are most interested in developing further. And there's, you know, the empirical literature is not very solid on this point, but there's some interesting contributions. For instance, the philosophers of science around Michael Dietrich, in a paper from 2020, I'm going to reference it in the end, they looked at a large number of scientific publications in order to analyze how scientists themselves explain their choice of experimental model. And this just concerned the choice between one animal model and another. So why do they pick the particular model they used? And what they found was a large number of different considerations, 20 in total. Here are just 4 cherry-picked examples. The interesting thing about that list of 20 criteria is that only about half of them are scientific in a narrow sense, as we might think of them. You know, considerations like, okay, does the model respond to experimental intervention? Is the model tractable? Does the model resemble the target system? Those kinds of things are important, of course. But there's also the more social, economic, political factors at play at the same time. I've just cherry-picked 4 of them here because I find them particularly interesting. So people say very, very explicitly that they prefer to use models that they are well educated in using, and it stands to reason that that's a good strategy, right? Of course, a model is only of use to you as a scientist if you are well educated in using it, if it's popular in your scientific network, because then you can get colleagues to advise you on the small nitty-gritty questions that always arise in experimental work. You need infrastructure and institutional support, so people tend to use those models that are well supported at their institution. Right? Many universities have animal facilities. Not every university has an organ-on-chip facility. So that makes a difference as well. And of course, funding is a big thing, a big factor. Right? People tend to work with the models that they can easily get funding for. Now we can kind of extrapolate. This is speculation, but we can expect that people tend to develop further the models they expect will be the most attractive to use. So this landscape of scientific work is again relevant, right? So I'll kind of mix these 2 things. Absent policy intervention, there's going to be a bias in favor of the status quo here, right? If let's say you work in a field where mice are usually the model of choice, right? Maybe cardiac development. Then new people coming into this field will be educated in using mice to study questions in this field. There's going to be a natural network of people who work with mice in this field. Infrastructure will be provided, institutions will know how to deal with mice as models for this field, and funders will expect you to use that model. That is just sort of a natural state of affairs, that there's going to be an incentive here to continue business as usual, more of the same, even though we are talking about innovation. It's also conservative in a way. So a realistic phase-out plan would have to intervene in these areas, right? It would have to build up a built environment of scientific work and innovation where there's so much education going on for models other than animals, so strong interventions in, to enable people to work together in different constellations so they learn about other ways of doing research in that field, where infrastructure development and funding systematically advantage models other than animals to such an extent that innovation goes there. I think that is what would be needed if there is to be a realistic phase-out plan. This means that animal experimentation policy here really can't be a matter of just laying down a licensing procedure, telling people what they can and can't do, and doing harm-benefit analysis. This goes way beyond that. This goes into completely different areas, mostly of science policy. Right? In Switzerland, just to give an example, we have an infrastructure development strategy for higher education, but animal experimentation policies don't figure into that at all. There's no representation of that side of the story, so NGOs don't get to advise on that. It's just not a room where they are present. So that would have to change here, just to give that one example. All of this will cost a lot of money, by the way. So that's just something also to keep in mind. So I think realistically, a phase-out plan can't just be a 3 Rs plan. That's part of it, but we also need to steer the landscape of innovation. That's the long and short of it. Let me get to my second question. These proposals for phase-out plans or strategies, are they effectively calling for a ban in increments? To an extent, I could say the same thing here about bans that I've already said about the 3 Rs. They name a kind of measure, right? So they can be part of a strategy. They are not themselves yet a strategy. Bans come in different degrees and areas. You could go with Steve Race and just focus on medical research. That's what I mean by an area. You could go with the, you could go that way. You could also go with some of the Swiss initiatives, go for the hyper-maximalist solution, ban all animal experimentation immediately, and even add an import ban on products that have been tested on animals. That's really the hyper-maximalist solution. But you could also go the other way, gradualize maybe the idea, maybe don't talk about a prohibition, but about a system of quotas on licenses. That's what people often think I mean. When I talk to them about animal experimentation phase-out planning for the first time, they think I mean a system where we say, okay, this year or next year we're going to allow 600,000 animals to be used in Switzerland for research. The year after, it's going to be 500,000, then 400,000, and so on until we reach 0. And I don't think that's what anyone's ever actually meant by the term. That's not what any of these NGOs or politicians ever called for, but it's a sort of natural, intuitive idea of what phase-out planning could be, and it could be that, right? That could be your catalogue of measures. I just think that the worries about this approach are fairly obvious. It's a possibility in any case. You could also differentiate maybe between using prohibitions as an initial measure in the sense that it's already lined up as one of the measures you're going to take. Steve Race's prohibition bill does that. It says that the Secretary of State must, by regulations, prohibit the use of animals in medical research from the 1st of January 2035. So that's already planned. That's kicking in 2035, period. Another way to go would be to use prohibitions only as an escalation once softer measures haven't worked, right? You could say, okay, we are not going to start by prohibiting things or putting quotas on things, but we are going to design a policy mix around infrastructure and networks and funding and education with the aim of bringing about a 10% decrease in animals harmed in a country over a time span of 5 years. Then after 5 years, if we see that 10% decrease, and if we don't, then the quota kicks in, right? So we brute force it if it doesn't work otherwise. That would be a kind of a more nuanced way of building a prohibition into a plan. All of these are just possibilities, right? Steve Race evidently has chosen to strongly focus on the prohibition aspect of Herbie's law. I think more than Animal Free Research UK themselves do. And that's one way of approaching the conversation, right? So his approach is we set the deadline. By 2035, you have to be done, deal with it. It's not very specific on what is to be built up in the meantime or what else should be done. It's really just setting a deadline, putting pressure on scientists. I think that's one way of starting the conversation. In Switzerland, it would not fly at all. I'm not that familiar with the British political discussion to gauge whether it's a wise approach or not. In Switzerland, I know it would be an absolute non-starter, conversation stopper about this topic, because we've already voted 5 times on whether we want a prohibition, and people have said no every time. I really think there's a risk in overemphasizing prohibitions in this context, right? I'm not talking about thick prohibitions in a general sense. I'm really just talking about this particular political context. It's easy to think of the decline we want to see. That's part of any technology transition, right? We want to end certain things. We want to end fossil fuels. We want to end animal experimentation. That's the part of the story we can easily think of, right? And if you look at historical examples of how these technology transitions play out, then of course you can see stories of decline, right? When the steamboat overtook the sailboat, or when the car overtook the horse-drawn carriage, of course you could see a technology in decline, the old solution, right? For a while people tried to optimize it, but the systems, how they work together and how the technology is manufactured and kept up is destabilized, falls into chaos, breaks down, and is ultimately phased out. And of course you could try to force this development by putting prohibitions on the horizon. That's thing you could do. But in the examples, in the historical examples where it actually worked, there's always also the converse positive development, right? People experiment with new approaches, new solutions are accelerated, new winning solutions emerge, are institutionalized and stabilized into the new normal. In essence, you can't get the red curve usually without also having the green curve. And that's called the X-curve model in transition studies. It's a rule of thumb, right? Usually you see this pattern when technologies actually transition. And I think there's two reasons to think in terms of this model when we talk about animal experimentation. One is ethical reasons. It's not that animal experimentation doesn't do anything for anyone. It does do something for certain people. It does improve certain lives or prolong certain lives over time. I believe that. But if you only force the decline without forcing the build-up of alternative solutions, then you are going to have some ethical costs. Of course, I think from an anti-speciesist viewpoint, it's pretty clear how it plays out, but still, it's a consideration worth making. The other important consideration is political. Usually, there are powerful stakeholders in the room who are very attached to the old way of doing things. And in our case, that would be pharmaceutical companies, it would be scientific establishments. So very, very influential players, and they will militate against just the red curve, right? You have to kind of try to promote both the red and the green in order to not make them too angry. That's the essential idea. So I think, that's the long and short of it. You can't have the red curve without the green curve, so I think focusing only on prohibitions is a little risky. And to be fair, I already mentioned it, the draft bill that Animal Free Research UK themselves published is more balanced. It does have elements, here's just two examples, for pushing along the red curve versus the green curve. So in red here they say that the Secretary of State must ensure that any new grants for animal-based research and testing technologies must come to an end on the 1st of January 2035, so that's just bringing something to a halt. But then they also say the Secretary of State may work in collaboration with national authorities to create, distribute, and oversee new grants for human-specific research and testing technologies, so building something up, right? It's very, very general, but that's the general direction here. We want to build something up. They are not just calling for a phase-out plan, they're also calling for a phase-in plan, and I think that makes it much more realistic. Okay. I'd even go one step further, because I've already said it twice now. In Switzerland, really, the way to poison the whole discussion is to tie planning to banning. So I've made it a point to explain that one can even do planning without banning. You can emphasize the green curve over the red curve. What that would mean is, from the outset, you say, okay, we're going to be strategic about how we want to bring down animal experimentation, or at least the kind that harms animals. But the measures we're going to take as part of the strategy exclude prohibitions and quotas, right? Either as initial measures or as escalations further down the line. Even if we don't meet our reduction milestones, which we still can have, right? Even if we don't meet them, we are going to reorient and escalate our measures otherwise, but not resorting to prohibitions or quotas. And that's sort of my attempt to make the idea of being strategic in an area where we want to see a transition palatable in a context where the prohibition discussion is really poisoned. Okay. So that's, again, just an option, right? If the political context is different, one can focus on prohibitions, and maybe the UK context is relevantly different. However, if the prohibition bill, like I think most, somewhere I read 99% of private members' bills never become law. So if it happens to be one of those 99%, then maybe a planning without banning bill might be an interesting second idea to try further down the line. Okay. And this really brings me to my last main point. How politically promising is this? Calling for a strategy rather than a prohibition here and now. I've already talked a lot now about the first point. I'll mention three major political challenges. The first you've already heard. Stakeholders in science and industry strongly oppose new restrictions. That's no news to anyone, I guess. But we've really seen what that looks like in the Netherlands, in Germany, also in Switzerland. People really, really militate against anything that looks like a ban. And if it's not clear that a plan is not a ban, then you've basically, in Switzerland certainly, you've lost the discussion. I say planning without banning may help or might help, but I really think you have to put it front and center in order for it to work. I tried to explain to the relevant commission in Parliament when I was invited that this was an option on the table. Right? The bill that they were considering said just we want a phase-out plan for all animal experiments that harm animals. And I went in there and said, okay, just to make clear, that's one of the options you have. You could do planning without banning. I don't think that worked, because if it's not a safe, sure-made deal that it's going to be planning without banning, if it's not front and center in the bill, then even just the risk of prohibitions and new restrictions entering later in the conversation is enough to make pharmaceutical companies and scientists panic. And for understandable reasons, but I think that's just something one has to strategize around. Okay. So I really think this needs to be front and center in order for you to benefit the discussion. The second major challenge I see is appealing to the political right. If we look around Europe, I mean, Steve Race being a Labour MP is the best example. This is really an idea that appeals to the centre-left. This is in the party programs of Green and Social Democrat parties in Germany, in Switzerland, in the UK, in the Netherlands, and so on. The centre-right and far-right are uninterested, just not an issue to them. They never mention it. They also don't say we're against it, but it conflicts with general policy positions that they may hold, right, that may in certain ways be more in line with unrestricted science and industry, very restricted in other ways maybe, but not in this way. So they're generally uninterested. And it's very tricky to approach this conversation with someone who doesn't highly prioritize animal welfare or indeed science policy. But I have some tentative ideas, two of them. The first avenue is that clear goals enable the fiscal accountability of 3R centres. We are using taxpayer money here to pay for platforms and centres that are at least semi-public, in certain cases fully public, and they themselves tell us that it's very difficult to evaluate their work. That's usually a problem for semi-public or public institutions. Every museum, every school is subject to evaluation. 3R centres have really evaded honest evaluation for a long time, one could argue, and that could be an issue that even appeals to someone who is completely uninterested in animal welfare or in science. Right? Are we wasting taxpayer money here? Question mark. Of course, that's an argument that plays with fire, but I think you can't get through this conversation with the right half of the parliament without playing with fire a little bit. The second idea I have is that strategies can also close a space for political contestation. And this initially wasn't my idea. This was the idea given to me by a far-right Swiss MP. That was a really remarkable conversation I had with her at the Federal Palace. She met me and asked me 2 or 3 questions about animal experimentation in Switzerland. She wasn't really specializing in that. And I explained to her that around 600,000 animals are used a year. She asked me what species are they. I said, well, the majority are mice. She said, okay, I don't care. Okay, I don't care about 600,000 mice. So she took majority to mean 100%, whatever. She said, I just don't care about 600,000 mice a year. It's not a non-issue to me. It's just a nuisance that we're even talking about this. And she herself came up with an argument from that angle. Because she said, okay, well, maybe once we have a strategy and the next person comes along with an annoying initiative or petition on the issue, we can just point to the strategy and say, oh, well, let's wait for the next milestone and then reevaluate and let's see. Please don't now interfere with this well thought out process. Right? And that's, of course, one way for governments to deal with strategies and sometimes a reason why they have them in the first place. Again, totally playing with fire, right? Because that, of course, encourages the third problem I want to mention, that you can come up with strategies without teeth, right? If the only purpose why you're having a strategy in the first place is that you can point to it, then that incentivizes a strategy just as a fig leaf without any teeth. And that's certainly a problem, right? Just because it says strategy on the tin doesn't mean there's a strategy in it. And you could really use this to evade accountability also from governments and legislators. So that's a problem. I don't think there's a quick fix to this. I think the only way to deal with this is to be aware of the danger and to try and really hold governments and legislators to account. So really look at what is in the strategies. Are they strategies in the sense of the 3 M's? Or are they, for instance, rather vague action plans without any clear milestones, right? If we could call it a strategy, but then just say, by 2035 we aim to remain a leader in 3R's promotion in the UK. That's not a milestone. That's not an outcome, right? So it's just important to look at the details. Also, well, just to put that in other words, animal advocates shouldn't let themselves be appeased by talk alone. Maybe one more remark on that. Scandinavian, I think Swedish, political scientist Niels Brunson once coined a very good term for this. It's strategic hypocrisy. And that's important to understand in this context. When a government is faced with audiences that make very different demands of it, right? Animal advocates asking for a strategy to phase out animal experimentation, and scientists in industry asking for business to continue as usual, the most rational thing can be to publish a bullshit strategy, one that appeases both audiences, but kind of dupes at least one of them. Right? So again, a plan that's a plan in name only could be used to that end, but that's why it's important not to let oneself be appeased by talk alone. That's the idea here. Okay, so I think that's the bulk of what I wanted to say. If you'd like to know more about these developments, Raphael has mentioned that I've got a couple of papers out. Here are the most recent ones. I usually go more into the ethics of things than I did now in this talk, because this is an interdisciplinary audience, but if you'd like to know more, please check out these papers. Most of them, all but one of them, are free to access. I didn't check the publication policies of the one journal before publication. That was a mistake on my part, strategic mistake. The QR code will lead you to my ORCID page, and in the meantime, I thank you for your attention. Thank you.